The thunder seemed to tear the sky apart. The man who was enjoying a cup of warm tea was startled, reminding him of the image of last winter when he saved a pregnant dog. That decision changed his life. Carter had grown used to the stillness of his life. At 55, he lived alone in a small wooden house nestled in the rugged mountains of a remote border town. Each day followed a gentle, predictable rhythm. He would rise before dawn, don his worn hiking boots, and step outside to greet the misty morning air. He often paused on the house's porch to take in the distant peaks, listening for the call of a hawk or the rustle of deer in the underbrush. His brisk walk through the forested trails was a ritual of discovery, examining fresh deer tracks, watching a squirrel chatter above him, or stopping by a hidden grove where he collected pine cones for kindling. Once back from his walk, Carter would pass by a small vegetable patch behind his house, where he tended to rows of lettuce, carrots, and radishes. He took pride in coaxing life from the inhospitable terrain, watering the seedlings and checking for signs of frost damage. After Ward, he spent his afternoons in the workshop adjacent to the house, where he carved wood into chairs, tables, and the occasional custom pieces for the townsfolk. The rhythmic scraping of his carving tools and the faint scent of sawdust filled the air, a comforting soundtrack to his solitary work. Sometimes he would pause to sharpen his chisels or step outside to admire the grain of a fresh timber log he'd hauled in from a nearby lumber mill. A few times a week, Carter would make the drive into the small town at the foot of the mountain. There, he'd drop off finished furniture orders at the local general store, chat briefly with the owner about upcoming craft fairs, and pick up a week's worth of groceries. Occasionally, an elderly neighbor would ask for help repairing a broken chair leg or porch step, and Carter, being the town's go-to carpenter, would happily oblige, exchanging his handiwork for fresh baked bread or a jar of homemade jam. Evenings brought a quieter rhythm. As the sun sank behind the mountain ridge, Carter would light a fire in his humble stone fireplace, listening to the logs crackle and pop while he rested in his favorite armchair. Sometimes he'd read, flipping through well-worn books about woodworking or local history. Other nights, he'd simply let the quiet envelop him, the distant howl of a coyote or the murmur of the wind through the pines reminding him of the wild lands just beyond his doorstep. By all accounts, it was a simple life. Some might even call it lonely. But it was peaceful, and for Carter, that was enough. One morning, as the wind whistled through the mountain passes, Carter decided to go fishing in a nearby stream. He rose earlier than usual, brewing a cup of strong coffee before carefully packing a small lunch, a few sandwiches, a thermos of tea, and a chunk of homemade bread gifted by a neighbor. He grabbed his trusty fishing rod, a folding stool, and a small tackle box filled with extra lures, then set off along the winding path. The sun peeked over the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the trail. Carter paused more than once to marvel at the morning light filtering through the pines, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The farther he walked, the quieter it became, as though nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to arrive at the stream. The faint rush of water grew louder with every step, beckoning him forward. When he reached the stream, he found his favorite spot, a flat boulder jutting out over the swift current. He carefully set down his pack, unfolded the small stool, and prepared his line. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, and the crisp mountain air brought a slight chill, making him grateful for the thick flannel he wore. Once settled, he cast his line and watched as the lure disappeared beneath the rippling surface. Hours passed in contemplative silence. The water sparkled under the early sunlight, and once Carter thought he felt a tug on his line. A flicker of excitement flashed through him, only to find the hook empty when he reeled it in. Between casts, he observed a hawk circling overhead, scanning the ground for prey. Nearby, a curious fox appeared at the edge of the trees, sniffed the air, and then darted away upon noticing Carter's presence. Despite the tranquility, A growing disappointment formed in Carter's chest as fish after fish refused to bite. He tried changing lures, adjusting his casting technique, and even moving to a different patch of rocks. Still, he caught nothing. Eventually, the rising wind whipped at the branches overhead and stole the warmth of the sun from his cheeks. Carter pulled his coat tighter around himself, realizing that his feet had gone numb and his hands were beginning to ache in the chill. Deciding he had tested his patience enough for the day, he stood up, gathered his gear, and looked around at the serene wilderness one last time. He couldn't deny the beauty of the morning, even if it had yielded no catch. Slightly crestfallen and ready to warm up, Carter turned away from the stream, the sound of rushing water fading behind him as he made his way back along the winding forest path. On his way back, Carter found the road ahead was becoming slippery with slopes, the wind tearing through the pine trees like an invisible tempest. Just as he was shifting his fishing rod from one hand to the other, he heard a strange, soft whine, so faint he almost mistook it for the wind. Intrigued and concerned, he paused, scanning the rocky terrain. The sound repeated, this time more urgent, prompting Carter to veer off the narrow trail. His boots crunched over frozen pine needles as he carefully navigated around a fallen log. Rounding a cluster of large boulders, he spotted movement in the shadows. There, huddled against the cold, was a golden retriever, her coat soaked through and speckled with melting snow. Each labored breath caused her thin sides to tremble. Carter immediately noticed the dog's belly bulging. It is pregnant and in a miserable state. Concern lit his features as he knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Her tired eyes opened, revealing a mix of fear and relief. Careful not to startle the dog, he spoke to her in a soothing tone, though he wasn't sure if she understood his words. With slow, deliberate movements, he unzipped his own coat, though his fingers were stiff from cold, and draped it over her trembling body. The dog, later nicknamed Nesca, let out a soft whimper that turned into a shaky sigh. Sensing his kindness, it mustered enough trust to stay still as Carter gently lifted her into his arms. The journey back to the house felt longer than ever, and a biting gust nearly knocked him off balance. Determined, he pressed on, bending his body to shield Nesca from the gale. Every so often, he paused to shift his grip, making sure neither of them slipped on the slick ground. Eventually, the welcoming sight of the house emerged through the swirling snow. Carter pushed open the door, practically stumbling inside with Nesca cradled against his chest. Once the door was shut, the warmth of the house wrapped around them both. Carter hurried to the fireplace, kindling it into a bright blaze before gently laying Nesca on a spread of thick blankets. The dog shivered and let out a low whine, her eyes fluttering. Working quickly, Carter grabbed a pot, filled it with water, and set it on the stove to heat. Before long, he had a warm broth ready, which he offered to Nesca in a shallow bowl. She sniffed it hesitantly, then lapped it up, her trembling easing with each sip of warmth. Carter tucked more blankets around Nesca, drawing them closer to the hearth. He slipped off his wet boots and jacket, then crouched beside Nesca, softly petting her head as she rested. The dancing flames lit up the tired relief in her eyes. Though she couldn't speak, her gaze seemed to say thank you. And in that moment, Carter knew that his quiet life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. That night, the storm raged across the mountains, a fierce howl of wind rattling the small windows of Carter's house. Snow swirled like a thick curtain, the kind of storm that could isolate the town for days. Carter had settled in front of the fire with a book, the crackling flames a soothing contrast to the chaos outside. The storm seemed to grow louder with each passing minute, gusts racing down the mountain passes, howling around the eaves of the house. On the hearth, a kettle slowly began to boil, forgotten amidst the enveloping evening gloom. But it was the quiet whines from beside him that soon pulled Carter's focus. Turning, he noticed that Nesca, once curled up in sleep near the fire, was now shifting restlessly. Her breathing was ragged, a series of quick, labored breaths. Carter immediately knelt beside her, concern clouding his features. The dog's body trembled violently, and her eyes, wide and uncertain, met his gaze. She let out a soft whimper, and Carter knew in his gut. Nesca was going into labor. For a moment, panic gripped him. He had no experience in animal care, much less birthing puppies. His mind whirled, panicked memories of old books and long-forgotten advice from neighbors flashing briefly. But the storm kept up its ferocity, and Carter forced his mind to focus. There was no time to waste. "Easy, girl," he murmured as gently as he could. Nesca's eyes were filled with unease, and Carter felt a swell of empathy. He quickly pulled blankets from the nearby shelf and spread them near the fire to create a warm, clean area for her. His hands shook, but he fought it, focusing entirely on the dog's fearful eyes. Just then, a sharp crack of thunder shook the walls, and Nesca shifted, letting out a guttural cry. Carter's heart beat faster, but principle drove his actions. He stayed close beside Nesca, speaking softly as lightning split the sky just outside the window, casting brief, unsettling shadows on the ceiling. With a final deep cry, Nesca began to push, laboriously bringing the first of her puppies into the world. Carter held his breath, focusing on the delicate creature taking shape before him. The glowing embers from the fireplace mirrored the fiery determination in his heart. Over the course of an hour, and with each thunderous boom of the storm, Nesca delivered 5 puppies, each one more frail than the last, but each one fiercely determined to take its first breath. Carter wrapped them one by one in soft towels, whispering words of comfort as he checked them over for signs of life and health. His hands trembled with exhaustion, wet from the birth, yet full of awe as each tiny fragile creature was placed soundly next to Nesca, still panting, but content. Nesca's whimpers softened into exhausted contentment, and her eyes, once filled with worry, filled now with a profound new peace. She nudged each puppy toward her warm belly, her instincts guiding her through the exhaustion of the night. The storm outside continued its furious dance, but inside, in the flickering glow of the firelight, 5 puppies lay curled beside Nesca. For the first time in years, Carter felt the quiet stirrings of something in his heart, something that lived, something filled with hope. It was a tender, miraculous moment, a moment no one, not even this solitary carpenter, could have predicted. And while Carter's life had been calm and predictable, this night had changed everything. Over the next few weeks, the once solitary house buzzed with life. It started each morning with the excited chorus of tiny yips, waking Carter far earlier than he was used to. The puppies, now growing bigger by the day, rolled around. Carter named the puppies Blaze, Snowy, Comet. Buddy, who rarely left Carter's side, pressed against his leg for a reassuring pat. Nesca, finally regaining her strength, watched her brood with gentle tolerance. At night, the puppies would settle into soft bedding near the fireplace, curling up in a warm bundle under their mother's watchful gaze. He would sit near the fire, stroking Buddy's ears as the pup dozed off, marveling at how quickly his lonely life had been filled with love and laughter. One day, he saw on Nesca's ear a small star-shaped mark on her ear that seemed to be a lost dog. For days he mulled it over, even asking a couple of neighbors if they'd ever seen a mark like that on a dog around town. No one recognized it. One afternoon, while the puppies were napping on a pile of blankets by the fire, Carter carefully snapped a few photos of Nesca, her gentle eyes, her golden coat, and that peculiar star-shaped mark. He sat at his old wooden desk, tapping away on his outdated laptop, posting the photos to a local community forum and a broader social media group dedicated to lost pets. At first, He wasn't sure anyone would see his post, given how remote their mountain town was. He busied himself afterward by tidying up the workshop and double-checking the puppy's bedding. Late that evening, however, he noticed a flurry of online notifications. Curiosity and a flicker of excitement urged him to open the messages. To his surprise, he soon received a direct response from someone who recognized the dog immediately. They sent him links to a series of missing dog posts from a distant city. An unmistakable match, the same golden coat, the same star-shaped mark on the ear. That's when Carter first learned her real name was Bella, a dog whose owner, a journalist specializing in rescuing smuggled animals, had been desperately searching for her. A flood of new details emerged as he exchanged messages with the journalist's family and friends. Carter discovered that Bella's owner had recently dismantled a smuggling ring, putting herself at great risk. Dangerous criminals, enraged by her investigations and rescues, had taken revenge by targeting Bella, the very dog she had saved from a cruel fate years ago. These criminals had stolen Bella from her own home, driving her across state lines and, in a heartless move, abandoning her in the cold wilderness near Carter's Mountain. Bella's family had been searching relentlessly ever since, sharing her photo and story online in hopes of finding her before it was too late. When Bella's family finally contacted Carter, they expressed overwhelming relief to learn that their beloved dog was not only alive and well, but had also safely delivered her puppies under his care. In the days leading up to their arrival, Carter felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He made sure the house was tidy, placing fresh blankets in a cozy corner for Bella and the puppies. He even baked a small batch of biscuits, an old family recipe, to offer as a welcoming gesture. While everyone marveled at the puppies, Carter shared the story of Bella's rescue, how he'd found her shivering behind the rocks in a storm, how she'd gone into labor that very night, and how the puppies had filled his once silent house with life. Bella's owner listened intently, occasionally wiping away tears as she took in each detail. Then, in a softer moment, she looked around the humble but cozy room, the blankets laid out near the hearth, the still warm fireplace, the small vase of wildflowers Carter had placed on the table, and realized how well Carter took care of his dog. It was then that Carter felt a pang in his chest, realizing he would soon say goodbye to Bella and the puppies he'd grown to love. But he couldn't ignore the tug he felt each time Buddy padded over to him, tail wagging, seeking a gentle scratch behind the ears. Summoning his courage, Carter cleared his throat and asked Bella's family whether he might keep Buddy. He explained how this affectionate, bright-eyed pup had quickly found a special place in his heart, and how he couldn't imagine his days without Buddy by his side. Everyone was silent. Though it was clearly difficult for them to part with any of the puppies, they saw Carter's earnestness, how the big-hearted man who had saved Bella also had a genuine bond with her offspring. After a moment, Bella's owner nodded, tears brimming again, and agreed that Buddy should stay. There was a bittersweetness in the air as Carter gently scooped Buddy into his arms, feeling both elation and heartbreak for the inevitable farewell to Bella and the other 3 puppies. When it came time to leave, Bella trotted confidently behind her family toward the waiting car. Each puppy looked back at Carter, almost as if to say goodbye, while Bella paused to wag her tail one last time in gratitude. Buddy let out a small whine as he watched his siblings go, but a gentle pat on the head from Carter reassured him. The car disappeared down the winding road, leaving Carter standing on his porch with Buddy in his arms. Though sorrow hovered in the moment, warmth and hope for the future filled Carter's heart, and Buddy's bright eyes seemed to promise the start of a new, unbreakable friendship. Not long afterward, local authorities made a decisive breakthrough in the investigation against the smuggling ring. Acting on new leads shared by Bella's owner, the journalist who had gone undercover to expose the group, police conducted a raid on a remote warehouse hidden in the foothills. Officers rescued everything from neglected dogs and cats to a handful of exotic birds and even a small monkey, all victims of the group's cruel trade. Evidence of counterfeit documentation, illegal medicines, and forged transport papers sealed the smugglers' fate. Multiple arrests were made on the spot, and those criminals who tried to flee were swiftly apprehended. The operation's success made headlines across the region. With Bella's harrowing tale at the heart of the story, local newspapers and radio stations eagerly followed the trial. Each hearing revealed new details of the group's cruelty, provoking outrage and sorrow in equal measure. Ultimately, the smugglers were convicted, their operation dismantled for good, an outcome cheered by animal lovers and concerned citizens alike. When the cold season passes, Carter's home overflowed with new warmth. Gone were the days when a pin-drop silence stretched across the house. Now the sound of Buddy's tiny paws pattered against the wooden floors from morning until night. Each dawn found Carter rising with a renewed sense of excitement, slipping on his boots to take his trusted companion on a daily trek through thawing. Buddy would bound ahead, nose low to the ground, sniffing every new leaf, every budding wildflower, as birds returned to fill the trees with their bright chatter. In the afternoons, Carter and Buddy settled into the workshop. While Carter carved and sanded fresh pieces of furniture, Buddy happily dozed in a patch of sunlight by the door, or trotted around, curiously sniffing wood shavings. Sometimes, Carter would pause mid-task to show Buddy a scrap of cedar, letting the pup investigate its scent before placing it aside. Evenings brought a gentler bustle. After supper, Carter would unwind by the fire, sipping tea while Buddy curled up on an old rug near the hearth. Instead of the previous hush, broken only by crackling logs, the living room now filled with the soft snores and sleepy sighs of a growing dog. If the mood struck, Carter would pick up a worn book and read aloud in a low, comforting voice, feeling oddly at peace with Buddy's dozing form for company. Outside, peepers and crickets welcomed the warmer nights, their chorus a serene backdrop to the home's newfound harmony. Over time, Carter noticed he was smiling more, at neighbors when he drove into town, at passers-by on the trails, and especially whenever Buddy caught sight of him and bounded forward with unbridled enthusiasm. Carter realized just how transformative the past months had been. Once, his days were measured by the scrape of carving tools and the solitary view peaks. Now they danced to the rhythm of a playful pup and a heart opened by compassion. The mountains remained as grand and silent as ever, but Carter felt no loneliness standing among them. Instead, he felt part of something larger. How is your daily life? Happy or bowing? Share your feelings in the comments section.